Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us again for some working on some type things. So today we are part 2 of our series, and as Martin mentioned, I'd like to do another session down the line, but definitely after you've all had some time to digest all these kinds of things. Typography is such a huge topic. Okay, so today we're going to run through some CSS properties for type. I'm going to talk about open type features, but unfortunately we're not going to have time to actually implement or play around with them. So we'll do that in the next session. We'll look at responsive typography, and then, you know, what is the future of type? If we have time. We may not have time, and if we don't, I'll move that to the third session. So the repo is in the chat, and we'll be looking at a little bit of a practical exercise a bit later. Okay, and feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can type them in the chat, put your hand up, whatever you want to do, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so we've had a lot of CSS type properties for a very, very long time. And I'm sure you are familiar with these, such as color, size, weight, style. Sorry, I'm just not focused here on the screen, sorry. So color, size, weight, style, line height, letter spacing. These are all things you might be familiar with already. And those have been around since the beginnings of CSS. And then we also have things like text decoration for underlines, and we can add borders to type, etc., etc., etc. And then there's a few HTML tags as well that influence our how our typography is represented. And those are things like the strong and B tags, which add bold text, the I and M tags that add italics, and then tags like definition, site, keyboard, etc. Right, so those are the standard properties we've had for a very, very long time. I've already mentioned open type features, and this is something that we've only had recently. And open type features bring in a whole lot of additional ways that we can use type to display things. And here are just 3 examples. Standard ligatures, where you can see on the left feature on, and on the right feature off, and on the right feature on. Case sensitive forms, off and on, and fractions. So these allow us, for example, with a fraction, if we look at that first example there, 1 and then 5/8 pounds, with fractions on, that actually turns into an actual fraction. And if we don't have access to that and turn them on, the browser doesn't represent a fraction. So open type features are additional features that a font might support, and not all open type features might be appropriate to use all the time, but some of them are critical for great typography. Here are some examples, and there might be things you've already heard of. So kerning, as in space between letters. Fractions, I've mentioned. Ligatures, I'll speak about in more details. Small capitals is when we make a word or a phrase capital letters, but at the same height, X height of the lowercase, and which we generally use when we use abbreviations, acronyms, and so on. Swashes are typographic flourishes. Last week, we looked at some glyphs and looked at that missing one. That's the example of a swash. Superiors are when we align numbers, for example, for footnotes and endnotes and so on. But there are over 100 more of these. Okay. I'm not going to talk about all of them because most of them would not be available consistently across all typefaces. I'm just going to talk about one in detail, and then when we come back later, we'll look at some examples of these and how to use them in the browser. So let's look at ligatures. So a ligature is a special character in a typeface that makes letters that appear very close to each other a lot more easier to read. I'm just going to share, this is some text that used to live on our company website. a specialist financial services software development company. There are two ligatures here. You may be able to spot them. If you can't, they are in these places. So you'll see there the F and the I in financial is joined, because without that, you can see that the I with a dot would be very, very close, in fact, to the F, particularly with the F having a crossbar, and that makes it hard to read. So most good typefaces will look for these elements, and then when the font is being developed, and will create ligatures to make them easier to read. And the second one you may have noticed is in software, where again the F and the T are joined to create one glyph. And there again, F and T close together, same crossbar at the same height, would be again hard to read. Okay, I see there's a question from Jane. Jane, if you don't mind, I'll leave this one until we get into the type exercises. My short answer is yes, but we'll have a look at that in some more detail, if that's okay. Right. So to apply these open type features, we use a CSS property called font variant, alternatively also known as font feature settings. And we might apply a class, and then we would say, okay, for this particular item of text, I want you to show ligatures. Okay, so we can turn these on or off as required. Personally, I am not a fan of this particular one. I just think it looks really odd. Also, if this font is called Lato, it's available on Google Fonts. And if you use Slack a lot, you'll note perhaps that Slack uses, that's not me, Slack, the application, uses Lato as its default font. And if you just look around at some of the text you're noticing there, and you'll see that both of these ligatures are applied there. I don't like that particular FI, so I actually wrap it in a span and then turn the ligature off. But that's kind of a bit much, perhaps, for most things. All right, so let's say we have a text and we want to apply more than one of these open type features. Then we just separate them in the same a CSS property, and we separate them with a space, okay, not a comma. You may have noticed with CSS that when we add multiple values to a property, we don't separate them by a comma like we might do in other languages, but with a space. The other place where this is fairly obvious is in transitions, where if, transforms, if we want to say translate and rotate on the same element, then we separate them with a space. So that's just something to remember. If you're trying to apply multiple of these and then none of them are working, just make sure that you are using a space rather than a comma. So let's say we have a paragraph and we have a class of small caps. We want to say typography is great, but we want that to appear in one of our open type features, namely small caps. So we add a class, but before we've done anything or added any CSS, it's just going to look like this. So it's just going to look like a normal plain old text. If we then go to our CSS and we match that class, so small caps, and we say font variant small caps, then this particular item will now appear in small capital letters. Now these are not the same as capital letters. You'll note that the T, because it's the beginning of our sentence, is still bigger than the rest of it. And punctuation marks tend to also be. So we are only saying make this small caps, not capitals in general. Okay, so small caps is something we use fairly often, particularly in large bodies of text where we might be using abbreviations, acronyms, all those kinds of things. Then I've mentioned this already, but kerning or font kerning, the spacing between specific glyph pairings. So this would be, each font has kerning built into it. And if it's a well-constructed font, then the maker of that font would have looked at all the letters in conjunction with each other and seen when they appear in various combinations, what should the spacing between them be. Now, the browsers generally turn this on by default. So we don't need to turn kerning on. It's already there. Okay. We can turn it off. Okay. Not recommended, but it's possible. But the reason why I want to bring this to your attention is that we have letter spacing as a property in CSS, and that is not the same as kerning. Okay. Letter spacing refers to, in print, if we're looking at print and we're looking at type, something called tracking. And that is a fixed space between letters. Right? So kerning is variable, and kerning works on how does the font designer think the spacing should be between these particular pairings of glyphs. And that is not random. Letter spacing is random, and it applies between every single letter. So kerning is specific between certain glyph pairs, but letter spacing, the CSS property, will add the same uniform space between all letters no matter what. And importantly, it's applied after kerning. So the browser will apply kerning, and then if you have CSS in your letter spacing in your CSS, it will then apply that. So something to bear in mind. And all fonts have different variations of kerning. Okay, then the third one I want to speak about are numerals. So often you find a typeface and it uses a letter form for glyphs for numbers that don't match what you wanted to use. Now, I work in financial services design, so a lot of the time we're dealing with tabular data. And you don't want a typeface that doesn't have numbers that are the same height and the same width, which is often the case. So usually there's several different styles of numerals that are included in fonts. And there are generally two of these. One is lining, where figures are all the same height and on the same baseline, as is they're uniform, and that's what you want when you're presenting data that relies on numbers. And then the second one that we can count the most is what's called old style figures. And these are mixed height, and they're designed to have the appearance of ascenders and descenders like other lowercase letters. So a 7, for example, in old style will appear below the baseline, whereas a 3 will appear directly on the baseline. So you have different heights being applied to numbers in this. Now, old style tends to be the default for most typefaces. So open type features become very, very useful if you need to present tabular data that contains a lot of numbers, because then you can turn on your font variant to use lining numbers. There's some other numeric open type features, but we won't go into all of those now. So not all browsers support all open type features, so we need to be quite careful with this. Although nowadays, most of them do. There are some issues with Chrome, and there are some issues with Safari on not supporting all open type features, or not supporting them well, as in you turn them on and that actually looks worse than it did before. That is particularly true of Chrome. But we can use CSS Feature Detection. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I'm not going to go into it in detail. It's something you can read about, but it's very useful. And the CSS Feature Detection uses what we call the @supports rule. So we can say, does this browser support this particular CSS property? And like media queries, anything that starts with an @ in CSS then has very specific properties inside it. So we can say, does this browser support font variant caps, all small caps? And if it does, then apply this particular feature. any browsers that fail that support rule will ignore this. So we can make sure that even if browsers aren't supporting something typographically, they're not going to break or fail or cause any problems within the design. All right. So one thing that we also need to look at is fluid and responsive typography. The way we tend to do this these days, or in the past, perhaps I should say, because this is changing, is we would have a whole bunch of font sizes, and then we'd have a whole bunch of media queries, and then we'd change those as we go along. And we're going to do this in our little exercise and look at responsive typography. But there's a better way to do that these days, and I'll go through that as well. Unfortunately, there isn't the kind of browser support that we need, but it's definitely going to become the future for how we want to do this. Okay, there's something else we need to consider when we're speaking about type is vertical rhythm, and I'll speak about this in more detail in the next session as well. And we have a major problem between our design tools and how the browser renders things. So design tools, and here I'm talking about Sketch, Figma, etc., they always align to the baseline. You remember last week I spoke about the baseline, that's the bottom line. If we draw a line across the bottom of our text, for our X heights, design tools are always going to align to the baseline. Line height does not do that. Okay, line height does not do that. Line height actually, the CSS property applies space above and below the type. And we're about to see all of these things in action. Okay, so I don't want to talk any more about this. I'll come back to the slides if we have time at the end, but I'd rather get into going over that exercise and looking at the repo that I've asked you to download the fork. So if you haven't already, if you could open that in your IDE of choice. I use Visual Studio Code, but whatever you're using doesn't matter. I'm just going to get rid of this. Once you have it open, you should have something that looks like this. And if you haven't already, please run yarn install or npm install, whichever you prefer. So if you can just get your terminal open and run yarn install. Can we all see that? It's a bit small. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, so you just want to install that. And once you've done that, you can just type grunt. I'm just using grunt to create a local server. Nothing fancy. There's no build process or anything like that. You don't need to worry about it. So you can just type grunt and hit enter. And it should tell you that you've started a web server on HTTP localhost 8080. Is everyone up and running with that? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, everyone good?
Good.
If we use live server, is that still sort of the same? Because I see mine's running on port 5500.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Doesn't matter what port you're running on.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm just going to switch to my browser quickly. Also, just control or command click on that link. So it opens up in your browser. Command back, control, Windows. Okay, so a lot of the time when we're looking for fonts, probably the first place we go to is Google Web Fonts. And you know, you can browse around here, you can find your fonts, etc., etc., etc. So the one we're going to use today is a very common font. It's called Montserrat. And Montserrat on Google Web Fonts gives us a whole range of weights and styles and all of that. Now, you can see all of these styles. We really don't want all of them. Yeah. But what Google Web Fonts also tells us is Remember, I mentioned last time that we need to always make sure that we have all the glyphs that we need. So for Montserrat in Google Web Fonts, you can also click on glyphs, and it'll show you a sample glyph set. And you can go and check, what languages support you might need, and so on. Now, on Google Web Fonts, you can go and select styles. So let's say we want a light, we want a regular italic, and we want a bold. And Google is now collating all of these, and it's giving us a style sheet link that we can go and pop in the head of our document, and off we go. Now, I do not recommend this. Okay? I do not recommend using Google Web Fonts on Google and using their CDN for whatever reason. The major reason I'm wary of doing this is that you have no control over that download. Okay. And every time here we're saying, okay, give me 4 of these web fonts. First of all, you'll notice that there's a link in this to a style sheet that lives on Fonts Google APIs. So that's one connection the browser needs to make. That's an issue already. Once the browser's made that connection, it then needs to download these 4 fonts that we're looking at. So we're looking at 5 cross-origin requests. And that's leaving your particular domain, it's going to Google, and then it's bringing it back. You never know how fast or how slow that's going to be. Now, there used to be a thing where people would say, oh, but people have been browsing around the web and these fonts are now cached in their browser because they're likely to have hit Google a number of times. But it turns out that that's actually not the case, and they aren't necessarily being cached. So you're not really looking at saving anything by hosting them on Google. Another reason is when we download and self-host our fonts, we have way more control over how they're served. So we can preload them, we can cache them using a service worker, and we can also apply CSS properties to them that make it a lot easier for us and improve our performance. So my recommendation is to use Google Web Fonts if you're looking for free fonts, but only use Google Web Fonts to find the font that you want. I would then suggest that you go to a site called Google Web Fonts Helper. I'm just going to pop this link in the chat. Okay. The other thing is, if you're on Google Web Fonts and you're on Montserrat and you say download this family, it's not going to download web versions for you. It's only going to download OTF or TTF font files, which means you now have to go and convert them to WAF. And yeah, nobody wants to be doing that. There are lots of tools to do it, but yeah, it's a bit of a painful process. Google Web Fonts Helper gives you everything that you need to use Google Web Fonts and host them yourselves. So when you arrive here, you'll see they've got 1,280 fonts, and you can browse by styles. So you can say, show me all the sans serif fonts. And those are all here now. And you can then do additional filtering by number of styles, popularity, number of character sets, etc., etc., etc. Now the font, as I mentioned, we're going to use is Montserrat. So I would normally just go, okay, what font am I using? I'm using Montserrat, 18 styles, that's great. I'm going to select that. And you'll see that we have a number of options we can now work on. So by default, and you can't change this, you must download the Latin character set. And that is the alphabet that we are familiar with. You can also add Cyrillic and Cyrillic extended. You can add Latin extended and Vietnamese. Now, these are all determined by what languages does the typeface support. So, if you needed to use an Asian language other than Vietnamese, say Chinese or Japanese, for example, you're not going to be able to use this typeface. However, if you want to use it for Arabic or Russian or any of those kinds of Cyrillic languages, you're good to go. Okay, by default, regular is selected, but you can then go and make a selection of all the weights that you want. You'll see what's also going to happen here is it's going to give you the CSS that you need. Right, so I generally would go, okay, I want a light version, I want my regular version, I want my italic, and I want a bold. Okay, I don't bother with bold, italic, regular, italic, light, italic, etc., etc. Once we're loading more than 4 font files, we're starting to get a very, very heavy performance issue. So you can make your selection. If you scroll down here, you'll see this is now updated and it's put in my 4 selections. Now, I never go best support because we don't need to be supporting things like IE 6 to 8, etc. So I just click on modern browsers, and this is going to give me WAF2 and WAF. And then once I've gotten this, I actually just go and get rid of the WAF because we no longer need it. Okay, so I can copy this, I can pop it in my CSS folder. If I want to put my fonts in a particular folder, I can just go and update this. So you can see if I remove the fonts prefix, that's automatically updated. But never put it in your root. I always put fonts in the fonts folder, and you can see that that is updating. But you might have it in, say, source, static fonts, whatever it might be. Depending on your application, and this is automatically going to update for you. So it's a huge time saver. So you want to copy this and put it in your style sheet. You don't need to do this. I've done it already for you. Download the font files, and as you can see, you are now ready to self-post Montserrat. So this is a super helpful application, Google Web Fonts Helper, and I recommend bookmarking it and using it whenever you want, to self-host a font. You can change preview sizes, you can edit the sample text, you can really do all the things on here that you can do on Google Fonts. Right. So once that's done, and you'll see in style.css, I've gone and I've just copied in those font face rules that I've gotten from that Google Fonts Web Fonts Helper. And we've got a fonts folder, and inside that we've got our 4 weights. Our 300, that's light, our 600, which is bold, our regular italic, and our plain old regular. So that's all done, and we're now ready to go. Okay, then something that I like to do as well is to go to the weirdly named. Well, I thought it was weirdly named, and it took me ages to figure out what it actually means. I must have to admit, Whack-A-My Fondue, which is supposed to mean, what can my font do? And on your local machine, you can go to this site, and then you can actually just drag a font file, and it can be any kind. You can do the WAF2. So I'm going to just drag my Montserrat version 18 Latin regular WAF2, which is my regular Montserrat, and I'm just going to drop it here on this element. It doesn't upload the font, it just reads it off your hard drive. And here we are now getting way more additional information about this typeface. So it's telling us Montserrat regular, we've got 225 characters, and we've got 8 layout features. Now, layout features are those open type features I was talking about earlier. It tells us what's the latest version, what's the size, how many languages are supported, who developed it, and here's a list of all the languages that we have support for in the Latin version of Montserrat. And then here are our layout features. Okay, so you can see we've got denom, which we can ignore for now, but it supports fractions, it supports ligatures, it supports line numbers, it supports proportional numbers, it supports tabular numbers, and it's curved, which is great. Now, you could drop another font on here, and it's going to give you a whole different range of layout features. Some of which of these might be across those, some might be missing, there might be many, many more. So I'll just keep scrolling down here, it gives us a little preview. And then as you carry on, it's showing you now your layout features or open type features. And we can turn these on and off, and it'll show us. So fractions. So it shows all the layout features. So, okay, tabular figures. These are great because they're evenly spaced. If I turn them off, you'll see there isn't even space between the letters, between the numbers. So there's a very helpful open type feature, etc., etc., etc. Okay, we've got standard ligatures. And we know that this feature is turned on by default by the browser, and the same with kerning. Turn it off, and you'll see how that text is jumping slightly. So it's going from this is kerned to now they're just equal spaces between the letters. Same with ligatures, you can turn them on or off if there are any that are worth looking at. Shows us our character set, and then it also gives us the style sheet that's going to use CSS custom properties with, we'll see here, the supports feature where appropriate. And if you want to enable all these open type features, this is a style sheet that you can just. Okay, so we're not going to do this now. We'll come back to this because this is largely about open features. But this is a very, very useful tool to do some basic checks on your font. Like, what are the characters? You know, do I have all the characters I need? And here you can turn layout features on and off. And you'll see if I turn them off, those are the regular characters. But if I turn them on, we've got different things. So we've got all our different kinds of numbers. So you can actually say, okay, there's my standard one. Now let's look at all the different variations of those numbers that are available. So super, super useful tool and something that I use all the time whenever I'm evaluating type things. All right, so let's get back in to our little bit of code. And in your browser, you should be seeing something like this. Is everyone seeing the same thing? It all looks pretty bad, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to our Visual Studio Code or whatever we might be using, and let's run through a few of these things. Now, the first thing that you might notice is there's a style sheet called default css.css, and this is just a basic reset. Okay, so you may have heard of CSS resets before. I'm not a huge fan of doing large ones. I just do a few basic things, adding box size and border box, adding a min height of 100 BH to my body to make sure it's always 100% of the screen, adding scroll behavior smooth, and then adding text rendering to optimize legibility. Okay, so this text rendering is an important typographic thing that we can add. We can add optimized legibility, we can add optimized speed, etc., etc., etc. Optimized legibility just works with a particular monitor, and it applies what are called hints to the text to make it more readable. I just do a quick thing on an A to say if any link that doesn't have a class, use the text decoration skip ink a property, and that specifies how our underlines are drawn. Should we go over a descender or should we go around it, etc. And I'll see that as an example. For images, I always just say make them match max with 100% and make them height auto. And then because images by default are display inline block, there's always a little gap underneath them. You can get rid of that by setting them to display block, but I don't like to do that because you don't want to change the display property of default. But saying vertical align middle on your image will get rid of that little gap you get underneath each of them. Something typographical. All inputs, be they buttons, text areas, text inputs, selects, whatever you can think, checkboxes, radio buttons, etc., use the default operating system font. So if you've ever specified a font and then you've gone and put in some kind of a form control, you might find that, hey, this isn't the font I want. So if we say font inherit on all of our form controls, then it's going to inherit whatever font we specify within our overall body tag. If we don't put this in, it's just going to go default to the operating system. Then some people prefers reduced motion on the operating system level to reduce, and this just says, okay, if people have done that, so have they set that? Have they set their motion to reduce? Then make animation durations really, really small. So that's kind of the basic reset I was used. There's some type properties in there, as you can see. Now, you might be familiar with other type resets like normalize and so on. And those are really, really, they do a lot of stuff. Okay? I'm not a huge fan of that, but what you want to do is entirely up to you. There's many, many different approaches to resets. I prefer to leave the browser defaults untouched as far as possible. And then make changes where I want to via my own style sheet. And then I've just added a quick layout thing here. This is just for this particular exercise. On our main tag, we're just centering it and giving just a bunch of padding. Okay, so let's open our index.html and we'll go through a couple of things here. So, pretty standard. Within our head tag, we've got our character set. Now, this is a really important thing relating to typography. So character set UTF-8 tells us how we should encode these characters. And this just allows for a lot more standardized items within our character set. So if we start to use special characters, or anything like that, we want to make sure that those all render correctly. So that's the initial type thing that we're already doing. The next thing, don't worry about. The next thing is just the responsive stuff. And then all pages should have a title. Now, after that, I'm using, you can see here, we're referencing our fonts, and we're referencing all 4 of them. And we're referencing them via the link tag, an href, but our relationship that we're creating here is preload. So we're saying for all the font files that we have in that fonts folder, we want to preload them. You might remember from last week, I said the browser only initiates that download once it has passed the CSS. What we're doing here is we're saying, don't wait for that, just immediately start loading these files. We have to say download it as a particular type, and we want to say download it as a font, and then what is the MIME type of this, and it's WAF2. So that's important. And then we need to add the cross-origin attribute just in case it's being fetched from a different domain. But most importantly, and I'm not exactly sure why this is, I need to do some more reading on this, but if you exclude cross-origin from this, even though it's on your server, your local machine, it's not going to work. As I say, I'm not entirely sure about that, and I'll do some more investigation. And then we're just loading to style sheets. Our default CSS, and our style CSS. All right, Then we've got a very standard HTML layout here. So I've just got a main tag, and then inside that I've got an article. As you can see there, article, and we're closing our main, closing our body, closing our HTML, and inside the article we have 1H1 paragraphs, and then a whole lot of H2s and paragraphs, and we have one. So very, very simple HTML layout. Okay, and as we can see, this is giving us this. Now, something to note is that, and if you are in Firefox and you go to your inspector, you might get a warning about that preload, but you can ignore it. You'll see in the Firefox inspector, and I'm just going to make it a bit bigger, there's an item here called fonts. I'm just going to go to my body and I'm going to fonts, and you can see there, because I'm on a Mac and I just specified sans serif for the font, it is loading the default sans serif font for a Mac, which is Helvetica. And if we go and we look at our H1, you can see it's telling us, well, the H1 is 24 pixels, our line height is normal, our spacing is normal, and our weight is 700. So these are all just default a browser, and all browsers will apply this in the same way. Our P, we can see our size is 16 and our weight is 400, and our H2 is 24 and spacing normal and weight is 700. If we click all fonts on page, it's just going to tell us it's Helvetica and Helvetica Bold, and it's going to tell us it's a system font. And if we hover over the version, it shows us on the page all areas where that particular font is appearing. So our Helvetica regular is all those paragraphs, and our Helvetica Bold is all that. Okay. So if you can, please open style.css, and we'll just run through this, and I'm going to explain some things that are happening here. Now, the main purpose of this is for you to go away with this particular style sheet and HTML and work on it yourself, and, add different typefaces, play around with the line spacing, play around with the sizing until you reach something that you are happy with. Right, so we've gone through this already. We're loading up all our 4 typefaces. Note that our font family is the same through all of these. Yeah, we've got Montserrat 4 times, and then our font style normal for our light, regular, and bold, and then our font weight 300 for our light, font weight 400 for our regular, and font weight 600 for our bold, and then on our italic we have font style italic. So now when we type Montserrat and font style italic, the browser knows it must use this font file. Okay. And then for each of them, we're saying font display swap. And I spoke about that last week. So, sure. Time is marching on. Right. Okay. So Martin said that you're familiar with CSS variables. So this is just a very basic kind of I've used my general variable setup for this, but remove the things that aren't relevant for this particular exercise around type. So there's just a couple of colors. There's just one font family, and then there's font size and weighting, line height, letter spacing, and so on, but no layout properties at all. Okay. Right, so let's just go through them quickly. So we've got our base color and setting that up. We've got our link cover color. We've got our link color for hovering. We've got our font family base, which is Montserrat, which must match what our font family name is here. Okay, those must always be identical. And then our fallback is sans serif. Now you could add more to that, but this is fine for these purposes. We've got a bunch of sizing. So I just like to use small, medium, large, extra large, 2 times, etc. And we are doing these in rem, not M or PX, although, you know, it's up to you what units of measure you want to use. And then we've got 3 styles. We've got 300, 400, and 600. Sorry, 3 weights, 3, 4, and 6. And these correspond to our 3, 4, and 6. And then we've got 1 style, which is italic, that corresponds to our italic. Okay, then we also have line height. And again, we're using our small, medium, and large. And then we have letter spacing, which we are doing for small and medium. Then we have a media query using min width. So we're saying anything above 56 M and above. Let's bump up our font sizes for our XL, 2XL, 3XL, and 4XL. All right, is everything clear so far? Any questions? Are we all good?
Good. Yeah, we're all good.
Thanks. Okay, so the first thing I'd like you to do, please, is to go to your body tag, and where we have font family, let's change this to our base, font family base variable. So just copy that out. And we're going to go down here and we're going to get rid of our sans serif. And we're going to type var and brackets and then just paste that in. Okay, everyone managed to do that? When you go back to your page, it's sort of automatically refreshed. And you should see now that we are using Montserrat. And if we go to our fonts and we select anything in here, it should tell us what are we using each time. So Montserrat regular, Montserrat bold, semi-bold, whatever it might be, and so on. And if we scroll down here, you'll see that all fonts on page, and it's telling us this is being loaded via font fix. And you can see all the weights. Is that all working for everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, now, so that's how we now get our custom fonts set up, and that's great. We're happy with that. That's working, but you know, this is still incredibly unreadable. And the reason for that is that there isn't much hierarchy. We've got just 2 default sizes that are arriving via the browser. And one of the things that makes it particularly unreadable is that the lines are so long. So if I expand this on my large monitor, you can see how wide it is. That's almost impossible to read. So one of the things that makes type on the web and on the screen really readable is if we can go for a shorter line length as we possibly can. So one of the things that we can do is, you'll see that I have a bunch of classes here called good type. You know, that's not a good class naming convention for your websites and applications, but it works fine for this purpose. So let's just go and copy that good type, or you can just type it, and you'll see on our article in our index.html, we have a class that's empty, and we can just go and pop that in there and save. And now we should have something that looks like this. Everyone got that? Yes? No? Maybe?
Yes, it looks like the same.
Okay. So we've gone from this, which is terrible and hard to read, to this, oops, sorry, which is a lot clearer and a lot more easy to read. So let's have a look at what has been done here. So if we go back to our CSS, you see I just nested everything inside that good type property, class name, sorry. That's not necessarily the best thing to do, to nest things inside always, but this is just for these purposes. So the first thing I've done is I've gone and applied and to this article a line height, that is our line height large. And you can see our line height large is 1.7. Now line height should always be done as a unitless number. I mean, there are debates around this. Okay, let me not say always. I think that line height should always be done as a unitless number. So what this says is take my font size, multiply it by 1.7, and now apply that as my line height. So if we have our font size medium as 1 rem, wherever we're using font size medium and we are using line height large, our line height is going to be 1 times 1.7. Does that make sense? So if I go back to my inspector, and you can see I'm applying this line height on this good type class, and I go and turn it off, you can see how cramped it is. See how cramped that now is. So that is the browser default. And if we look at computed styles and we turn on browser styles, you can see that the line height applied by the browser is just called normal. Sorry. There we go. It's just called normal. And it's very, very tight and very, very small. So we really want to be having a higher line height. Now, I'm very partial to a lot of line heights. Yeah? Lots of spaces between lines. Not everyone goes as high as me. If you go back to that particular item and you change line height large to line height medium by doing line height MD, you'll see it's now at 24 pixels or 1.5. So again, this is largely a personal preference. I find this too tight and too hard to read. I most prefer to go bigger with my particular line. Right, so that's the first thing we do. You can ignore this. If you're interested in this, it just says anything inside good type. The star selector is X means select every element, plus means adjacent. So here we're saying any element next to any other element, give it a top margin of 1.5M. That's more layout than anything else. And then I'm saying here I'm adding some properties to my H1. I want my H1 to be my font size 4XL, and we can see that then applies that particular property, 4XL, and our layout, sorry, our computed size is 48 pixels. See there where it appears on the style sheet. I'm making it bold. For my H2, I'm applying my 2XL font size, and you can see that is 1.5 rem. And I'm applying my font weight thin. So you can see that we've got bold on our H1, then we have our light font on our H2, and if you go to fonts, you can see there our font weight is 300. Now the Firefox Font Inspector allows you to experiment with this. So you could maybe go, oh, okay, I think that's too light. I want it to be more bold, and you can actually just drag this particular slider, and it will show you based on the fonts that you've installed what you can do. If you don't like the line height, you think it's too much or too small, you can also play around with that in the inspector here. And course, the size and also the letter spacing. Right. Okay, so, and then our link, here we're just really adding our link colors with the hover. So if we go to our link, you can see we just got a color and hover, but remember, and I'm just going to zoom in, we said on our default CSS, we said text decoration, skip ink auto, and what this means is that we are saying when you underline something, don't go through the descendants. You can see here, everything, the lines are broken up with descendants. So you see here in our rules, text decoration, skip ink auto, and there are a bunch of different properties. There's none, as you can see with none, the underline is going straight through those descendants, and that is great. So we can do, we highly recommend it. Okay, now if you go and you resize your screen, so if we have to go into a responsive mode, you should see that the type is going to change when we get to a specific size. And the first thing that you notice really most is on the H2. And you can see there our font size is changing for our mobile device. But you might notice as things start to wrap, so this header, for example, and when we're on desktop, this header as well, we've got some problems here with the spacing. So our line spacing of 1.7 is great on our paragraphs where we have smaller text, but it's not great on our headings where we have larger text. Because remember, line height and a unitless number is a function of the font size times that number. So here we're getting fairly substantial line height on our header. And if we go and look at our computed style, we can see our line height on this is 54 pixels, which is really high. And if we look at this one, our line height is 81. So that's very, very high. So what we really always want to do is take our line heights that we specify on H1s and so on and make them a lot smaller. So what we're doing on, when this is all inherited, our line height is applied on good type. So the headers are inheriting that. We would want to just go and change those. And instead of our line height large, we can add our line height small on our H1s and H2s. And you can see now we have a way better spacing. And when this gets smaller, and you can see our header there, when it wraps, it's looking much, much better before and after. Before and after. So always bear that in mind. If you're setting a big line height, then you could run into issues with larger font sizes when they wrap, and there being a lot of spacing that you don't want between the lines. So to bear in mind. Okay, time is getting on. We're a bit over. I just have one more thing quickly, and you'll see here I've got these media queries, and we're saying when we're bigger than this, then apply these change these variables that we've set up here. If you go to index responsive, and then you open also style responsive, see we're doing something slightly different. So if you can just open up in your browser index responsive.html, see we have exactly excuse me, we have exactly the same page as we had before, and now, but if you go and resize this, you will see something very different happening. Whereas before, there's a jump always when the media query kicks in and a type size changes. Now, when we do this, you'll see it's going to start to shrink proportionally out that jump. So our font is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's unreadable. So this isn't the best combination of things, but it's just to demonstrate that we have some properties now in CSS that are allowing us to get rid of media queries. And if you look at style responsive.css, you'll see something called clamp. So clamp is a CSS property that says you can not be smaller than this, but you also can't be bigger than this. So if we look at this, we're saying our paragraph, yeah, you can't be smaller than 0.875, which is around 14 pixels, but you also can't be bigger than 18 pixels. Ideally, we would want you to be 2VW. So VW is vertical width. So we're saying, ideally, we want your font size of each letter to be equal to 2VW, which is 2% of the size of the screen. And then we've got the same for H1 and H2, but for H1, we're going way higher with the sizes, and we're going way higher, smaller than H1, but higher than paragraph for H2. And then we've set these up as our variables, and then when we come down to our H1, our font size is now referencing that clamp. Bar H2, bar H1, and then our P bar paragraph. And because we're saying min, ideal, max, browser now, when we scale, moves between those sizes. So if I go to my font inspector and I look at my paragraph, you can see here our size is 18 pixels. And when I start to move this and then refresh, you can see it's now moving at 16, which is on the right. So previously with responsive type, as I said, we had to run all these media queries. And if we look at that, when we resize, then we see these jumps that happen. It's not ideal. With clamp, we can just have things that scale perfectly without any of those jumps. We just need to get the sizing right, appropriate for each particular font. Right, I'm wary of time. I think that's all we have time for today. I hope that was useful. There's some questions, but I don't know if people want to hang on so I can answer them, or answer them in the chat or on ZTech, or whatever's your preference. I'm happy to stay on.
Okay. What we usually do, Justin, is those that need to go there, they're more than welcome to leave. But if anybody wants to hang around and ask some questions, and if Justin's happy to hang around, you guys are more than willing to hang around.
So thanks everyone. So just a question there, is there a difference in applying bold in HTML via the B tag and applying bold in CSS via font weight? Yes, there's a definite difference. When you're applying the B tag in HTML, you're directly influencing the markup. So you're saying this needs to be emphasized for whatever reason. And that usually occurs within paragraphs. Yeah? So you're writing something in a paragraph, you want to emphasize it, then you would use the B tag. And the reason for that is the screen reader then knows, okay, this is emphasis. Same with strong and B, they do the same thing. If you say, okay, I've got this word in this paragraph and I want it to be bold, and I'm going to wrap it in span with a class and then give that class font weight bold, the screen reader is not going to know that that is for emphasis, because it can't access the CSS property in that way. So that's the major difference. The other thing to bear in mind is that HTML is for markup, or whatever you might be using. If you're in React or whatever, you're using JSX or whatever it might be, same thing. HTML is always going to be for markup, and CSS is going to be for styling. So an emphasis within a paragraph is not a styling issue, it's a content issue. if that makes sense. So it should be dealt with an HTML tag. If you've got something that you want to be bold purely because you think it looks better for stylistic reasons, and it has no real meaning in terms of the content, then you would do it in CSS. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Cool. I think that is related to Jane's question somewhat. Separation of concerns. Should styling only exist in CSS? My short answer, as I said, is yes. So separation of concerns, it's been something that's been around since the web standard movement, like 20 odd years ago. But I do concede that the lines are blurry. So to my mind, we should still be working on those principles of separation of concern. That is HTML for marking up content, CSS for styling it, and JavaScript for adding interactivity of any kind. The advantage of that is that of having CSS for styling in a separate file, or however you might want to do it, by a Sass partial or whatever it might be, is that if you need to update something, you only need to do it in one place, if you've written your CSS correctly. If you're bringing styling into HTML, then wherever something appears on a site or an application and you need to change that, you're changing potentially many, many templates, as opposed to that one thing residing in CSS. And then there's the kind of design principle behind it, that your HTML should, and your content should be able to live without CSS. Yeah? And that CSS is for creating layouts and style, not influencing the content in any way. However, we are seeing more and more with front-end frameworks like React that we're moving towards writing CSS actually in JavaScript. But that's a developer choice rather than the way it actually gets rendered in the browser. So we might write CSS within something like CSS in JS or CSS modules or vanilla extract or whatever it might be. But ultimately, the browser is reading that as a standalone CSS file. So the method of writing it may go against separation of concerns, perhaps with JavaScript, CSS being written in JS components, but the principles behind it are exactly the same. We're still using the same CSS properties we would normally use, and the browser is still consuming it as a CSS file. So in that sense, a little bit blurred, but the end result is the same. You're still separating your concerns. Does that answer your question, Jane?
I don't think a microphone's working, but I think you did answer that. I've actually got a question. Is there sort of a cap at how many fonts and font weights a person should be importing into their project? Like, I know a lot of designers, they'll go and they'll use like 5 different fonts, and each of those have got 7 different weights that they want to include. But you can't, if you try and put your page through one of like the Google page speed checker, it's going to moan at you straight away and suggest like 2 fonts.
It's going to cry if you do that. Yeah, it's a major problem, I find. I never go, if possible, I try to use one typeface, not multiple, and use different weights within that. So I often find that with variation in weight and style of the same typeface, you can get a lot done from a design point of view. If using more than one font, I would never use more than 2. And I would make very, very sure that one of them was only being used for, say, headlines. And then, would hopefully require only one weight. there isn't a hard and fast rule per se, but I'm definitely of the opinion that performance is a usability issue. It's not just a nice to have. And if your design requires 7 fonts, you're disadvantaging your user at the root of that because of those kinds of performance issues. I mean, can you imagine being like there's a shopping mall down the road from me near Simonstown, and it's a mobile data black hole. You know, I can't even open my Woolworths app to use my card when I go to the shop, which is, well, that's an issue in itself. But I mean, just there's so many places like that where you go and you're connected to 4G or whatever, but you're not getting anything. It's just nothing is working. And typefaces are the first sticking point for that. That's also why that font display property becomes so important. Because if you say font display swap, for example, you're saying load the default font and display everything in the default font. If your custom font doesn't download, it's fine. You can still use and read it. It's just not going to look entirely the same. Yeah, I'm kind of going a bit of roundabout with the answer. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's this is a hard and fast rule, but never more than 2, and try not to load more than 4 different variable weights and styles. I mean, if you can get away with, sometimes I don't even bother with italic. Because I know, okay, that's not going to be used. No one's going to use italic. Italic is very important for sites that are very heavy with writing and things like that, like newspaper sites or online journals or things like that. Italic is really important. Web application, you're probably never going to use italic. And if you do, you could probably just get away with the faux italic. So you can still say on a font in the browser, font style italic, without loading the italic file, and it will kind of render it. It's not a true italic, it's just a slant. But if you need it here and there, to my mind, that's fine. Yeah, you can get that because what you're losing on maybe a better designed italic version of that font, you are gaining in performance. So it's always a payoff. Yeah. Maybe you don't need that italic font. And you can get away with, I mean, often you can just get away with a bold and a regular, to be honest. But one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about is variable fonts. But we'll do that next time. But just quickly, so a variable font is one font file that has all the weights and styles in it, in one file. And these are new, but they're coming. You can already use them in the browser. So in that case, you just load one file and you can do all your preloading and caching and everything on that one file. And then you have access to whatever bolds, italics, any other styles that might be built in. You have access to those after loading that one file. So like Montserrat is 18 different styles. You can load one file that contains all of them. So that's a new development. Douglas, did I answer your question sort of in a rambling way?
No, you definitely answered it. You definitely answered it.
Douglas, you have a question?
Yes, there was a question. What happens if you choose a font that not all browsers can recognize? Must you always consider a backup font, or should, I mean, what should the procedure be on something like that?
Yeah, you should definitely consider a backup font. You may notice in that CSS file where I specify the CSS variable for font family base, I've got the Montserrat and then a comma and then sans serif. So that sans serif is the backup. So what that says is that if this Montserrat font file for any reason is not readable, then just load up the sans serif that is installed on the operating system.
Okay.
So that fallbacks is automatically built in if you make that declaration. If you say Montserrat and you end it with that and Montserrat fails, it's going to go to the default browser font and the default browser font is Times New Roman. And you don't necessarily want that. You do not want that. If you're using a sans serif, and then suddenly the browser is loading Times New Roman, which is a serif, and very, very different. So as long as you've got that like little, use this, but if this isn't available, use this, you're good to go.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Anything else?
No, I think that's going to be it, Justin.
Okay, thanks everyone. I know that was a bit rushed, but please feel free to pose, ask any questions or anything you're not sure of, or if you need some good reading material or links or anything like that on the Slack channel, and I'm more than happy to help you out and respond with whatever you might need.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking your time and sitting with us today. Really, really do appreciate it. That's been really informative.
Sure.
And I feel like there's a lot for us to take away from that, and different ways to think about fonts and all of it. Like a lot of the stuff that you've discussed there, people just don't actually know. And I'm sure a lot of us are going to have to watch the video again just to sort of, go over the things that you covered.
Feel free to use my variables to your heart's content, and just play around with the sizing and things if you wish. Yeah, there's nothing, I wouldn't have shared them if I was precious about them. So yeah, that's a set of defaults that I find works well for me. And we just need some tweaking based on the typeface. Yeah, so if you could get some use out of it, that would be great. Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks a lot, Justin.
Thanks a lot,
Right.
guys.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Cheers.